And we're going to move finally on to the author of the book that's been mentioned earlier in the meeting, and Zionism During the Holocaust, to Tony Greenstein. Tony, you have 15 minutes. Over to you.
Right, thank you, Esther. I mean, that was an extremely rousing speech from Ronnie, and I completely endorse it. If at the end of phase one of the so-called ceasefire, Israel does start the war again, we have to restart our solidarity in earnest. There must be no acceptance of the diktat from the Metropolitan Police that we can't assemble at the BBC because some synagogue goers might be frightened. We have to defy them, and we also have to start thinking seriously about direct action that paralyzes a government that is supporting genocide in Palestine, because we know that the police will not enforce the laws that we have. Now, Ronnie spoke about the parallels between South Africa and Israel, that the land was empty, that God gave it to them. All I would say to that is, in the words of Bob Dylan, every conquering nation has God on its side. There is really nothing new about this. And of course, the Zionists had God on their side doubly so. They also began their campaign with a slogan, a land without a people, for a people without a land. And they too claimed that the return to Palestine was ordained by God. But the reality was, and people forget this, is that Zionism was always of a Christian origin. The idea of the return of Jews to Palestine did not originate with the Jews. On the contrary, when Palmerston and Lord Shaftesbury urged the border deputies in the 1840s to agree to encourage the idea of a Jewish return, they firmly rejected it. The Pittsburgh Declaration of 1885 of Reform Jewry also rejected it. Every single Jewish conclave rejected the idea of a so-called return. It was the anti-Semites, it was the Christian Zionists who took up the idea that the Jews belonged in Palestine, for the very simple reason that Zionism was the best way of getting rid of the Jews in your midst. It wasn't difficult to understand in the slightest. So Lord Balfour, he combined both anti-Semitism and Zionism. In 1905, he authored the Aliens Act, meant to keep Jewish refugees from Russia out of Britain, but he had no problem in sponsoring the Zionist settlement in Palestine. And we know, regarding the Zionist project itself, today, of course, Zionism uses the Holocaust in every which way, not just Zionism, but the Western powers themselves. And it's very interesting if we look at it, because you would think today, if you looked around at the Holocaust Memorial, there's one being built by the Palace of Westminster, there's a museum in Washington, another museum in Los Angeles, Germany has a number of Holocaust memorials. You would think that the World War, that is the last war, was being fought on behalf of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. But it was quite the opposite. The British did not want to know, and neither did the Americans, about the Jewish inmates of the extermination camps and the concentration camps. And I touch on this in my book, and I will go to it now, because I think it makes really quite interesting reading, if I can find it. Probably not. Yeah, I mean, it was Anthony Eden. He was the foreign secretary during the war, and later the prime minister during the Suez crisis in 1956. And Eden was concerned that if Britain offered to take in Jewish refugees, then, and I quote, Hitler might well take us up on such an offer. The Cabinet Committee on Jewish Refugees, which was actually renamed to exclude the word Jewish, included Clement Attlee, and it sent a memorandum to the US State Department, and this was on the 20th of January 1943, warning that there is a possibility that the Germans or their satellites may change over from the policy of extermination to one of extrusion, an aim, as they did before the war, at embarrassing other countries by flooding them with alien immigrants. And similarly, a letter sent by the Ministry of Economic Affairs to the US ambassador in London explained how, in respect of a proposal to send funds to Geneva, that the Foreign Office are concerned with the difficulties of disposing of any considerable number of Jews should they be rescued from enemy-occupied territory. Well, fortunately, of course, Hitler was quite determined to stick to the policy of extermination. So the Western statesmen and the Western countries, Anthony Eden, Churchill, Attlee, and so on, were never embarrassed in the slightest. But I think this gives an idea of the mentality. The Holocaust was known about, I mean, Auschwitz was known about almost as soon as it was created in April 1942, because the Enigma code had been broken. So it wasn't as if they didn't know, although they claimed that later, but simply because the war was never about the Jews. Today, of course, we hear nothing but the Holocaust. But at the time, the Holocaust was the least of their concerns. And the same was true of the Zionists themselves. And I quote someone else. This was Chaim Weizmann. He was president of the Zionist organization for most of its existence before the creation of the Israeli state, and then the first president of the Israeli state. And in the fall of 1937, in an issue of a magazine called New Judea, he wrote, "Palestine is no solution for the Jewish problem of Europe. Palestine cannot absorb the Jews of Europe. We want only the best of Jewish youth to come to us. We want only the educated to enter Palestine for the purpose of increasing its culture. The other Jews will have to stay where they are and face whatever fate awaits them. These millions of Jews are dust on the wheels of history, and they may have to be blown away. We don't want them pouring into Palestine. We don't want Tel Aviv to become another low-grade ghetto." So this was the attitude of the leading Zionists to what was happening. And that explains why, when most Jews reacted to the advent of Hitler by immediately launching a boycott of everything German, such that the Göring called in the leaders of the Jewish community to get them to go abroad to persuade their compatriots not to boycott Germany, the Zionists were interested in only one thing, which was a trade agreement with Nazi Germany. They were interested, and I'm talking about the leadership of the Jewish agency in the Zionist organization, in exerting and obtaining the maximum benefit from the rise of Hitler in order to build their Jewish state. And that's something, of course, which we don't hear about today. We don't hear about, for instance, how the Zionists deliberately obstructed any attempt to rescue Jews if it wasn't to Palestine. So, for example, the leader of the Zionists in America, Rabbi Stephen Weiss, when told of a proposal to send refugees to Alaska, which was not subject to immigration control because they wanted more colonists there, opposed it because he said it was too cold for people, presumably unlike the ovens of Auschwitz, which, of course, as we know, were very well heated. But this was typical of the attitude. There were numerous other proposals in terms of settlement, and all of them the Zionists opposed. And I heard today, as I think all of you have, about the arrest of my friend and comrade Ali Abu Nima by what I would call the Swiss Gestapo. No doubt the excuse and the pretext was anti-Semitism, because shutting down free speech in Europe is now essential in order to combat anti-Semitism. And it's worth reflecting on the record of the Swiss state during the Second World War and during the Holocaust, because although it was neutral, it was the only neutral country that Nazi Germany didn't invade because of its financial links, its banks, and so on. It was certainly a pro-Nazi state. So, for example, when German Jews started flooding into Switzerland as a form of escape, Switzerland insisted that Nazi Germany put a capital J on the passports of anyone who was a Jewish German, a German Jew, in order that they could be distinguished and turned back at the border. Even Nazi Germany had hesitated to do this because of the international repercussions, but Switzerland insisted on it. So the Swiss state was, from the very top, throughout the war, complicit in what was happening. And for it now to arrest and now deport a Palestinian journalist, Ali Abu Naima, is really beyond disgusting.
Mm-hmm.
I want to just say a few other things while I've got time.
You've got 3 or 4 more minutes.
3 or 4 minutes, okay. I will try and do that quite quickly. There's quite an amazing thing, really, that usually when we have historical events like the Battle of the Somme in the First World War, or other events of a similar nature, the further away you get from them, the more distant they become and fall into a kind of memory hole. But with the Holocaust, it's different. Immediately after the war, no one really talked about the Holocaust except the left, incidentally. But today, it has become more and more part of a collective, if you like, imperialist memory. And the reason is quite simple. The Holocaust has been conscripted by imperialism in order to justify its plunder and genocide in the third world, in the global south. And that is important to understand. This is a completely false memory, but nonetheless, it continues. And that is why we are seeing things like Starmer, who went to the International Court of Justice and argued that the genocide in Srebrenica, where 8,000 people died, was a genocide, and in Vukovar, where 1,200 died. But apparently, according to David Lammy, his foreign secretary, the thousands who have died in Gaza, and it may well be 200,000 to 300,000, not the 50,000 who've been identified, that doesn't count as a genocide. So really, literally, we are being ruled not simply by war criminals, but by the equivalent of the Holocaust deniers who they lambast when it comes to the Nazi Holocaust. There is no difference between those who deny genocide in Gaza and those who deny the Holocaust. And anyone who is consistent should be arguing that. I have been asked to wind up. I really just want to say a very few things. In fact, I have covered most of it. So I think one of the most remarkable things is, I mean, we've seen Donald Trump, who is a clear anti-Semite, welcoming and supporting Israel in whatever it does, including proposing ethnic cleansing, which I believe actually the Biden administration supported, but it didn't do so openly. The Zionist project, which we're seeing playing out today, and incidentally, I don't accept that Israel is now stronger than ever. I think it is facing immense problems of its own. So it will be interesting to see whether they actually do resume the war in Gaza after the first phase. But we can see, I think, quite clearly that imperialism's project in the Middle East depends also on the collaboration of the Arab regimes. Without that, there would have been no genocide. if the Arab regimes, the Saudis, the Gulf Sheikhdoms, and so on, had said there is no more oil until Israel stops its bombardment, I have no doubt that very few people would have died in Gaza. And it's because of that we have to call out the absolute collaboration of the Quisling regime in Ramallah, the so-called Palestinian Authority. I mean, I'm involved with people in Jenin, where Israel is now waging war on it. But the Israeli attack on Jenin was prefigured by the Palestinian Authority's own attack on it. So we can see quite clearly that the Palestinian Authority is, if you like, a military subcontractor to Israel, just as Israel is a military subcontractor to the United States. So all of this is bound up together. But more importantly than anything, we have to reject the narrative that the Holocaust that occurred between 1941 and 1945, or 1939 and 45, if you include the disabled and the handicapped, that is any justification for the Holocaust that is taking place and has been taking place in Gaza over the last 15 months. Well, thank you very much. I mean, all the speakers have been brilliant, and this has been an excellent meeting. Thank you, Esther.
Thank you, Tony. And just a reminder to, if you're in London, to support Tony this Friday outside the Old Bailey at 9:30, where he's being prosecuted as a terrorist supporting Palestinians resisting genocide. So be there at 9:30 outside the Old Bailey on Friday if you can.